Welcome to the Knight and Rose Show, where we discuss practical ways of living out an authentic Christian worldview. I'm Wintery Knight. Desert Rose is away on vacation, but we do have a guest host today, Bonnie. Bonnie is a software engineer and a mother of 5 children, ages 4 to 18. She has a Bachelor of Arts in Theology from Prairie College and an associate degree in nursing from Jefferson State Community College. She's currently working on her MDiv at Birmingham Theological Seminary. So welcome, Bonnie.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we also have a guest for today's show, Dr. Keri Ingraham. Dr. Keri Ingraham is a senior fellow at Discovery Institute and director of the Institute's American Center for Transforming Education. She is also a senior fellow at the Independent Women's Forum. Prior to joining Discovery Institute, Dr. Ingraham spent nearly 2 decades leading within the field of education. Her areas of education expertise include innovation, thought leadership, research, online learning, best practices, customized hybrid program development, business model creation, operations effectiveness, and strategic planning for sustainability and scaling. She holds a Doctorate of Education degree and a Master of Education degree from Regent University and a Bachelor of Arts degree from George Fox University. Welcome to the Knight and Rose Show, Keri.
Thank you. So good to be with you today.
So, Keri, with your background and your degrees in education, I'm curious, were you a teacher before you kind of got into what you're doing? And how did you move from that, how did you move from that to being interested in education freedom and education innovation?
Yes. Well, thank you for the kind introduction. And where I got my career start was at age 22, fresh out of college. I started as a middle school teacher and then a middle school and high school coach, and did that for 8 years. So age 22 to 30, absolutely loved it. Had the opportunity to influence and positively impact students in my classroom as well as on the field. But from there, I saw that there's the opportunity in school leadership to influence the culture of the school. And I had some great leaders who I was learning from as I was a teacher and coach. I was observing them. And so I decided to get my master's degree and move into school administration. So I did that in a traditional 5-day-a-week brick and mortar school, was the head of a small school doing that. Enjoyed doing the business operations side as well as overseeing all of the academics and the teachers. And then from there, got excited about what would it look like if we started to deliver education, not just in a one-size-fits-all, but different delivery models. So then I led a virtual and a hybrid school. This was after I did my doctorate and dissertation. Absolutely love that. Did that for 4 years. And then started thinking that there might be an opportunity to help influence education, the entire field in our country, more globally than at the school level. So moved into public policy just over 5 years ago at Discovery Institute. It's an absolute joy to do this work. I can't get enough of it. Long days, 7 days a week. But there is such an opportunity right now in the history of our country to pass meaningful reforms and truly transform education. So I entered this right in the fall of 2020 when private schools were reopening in full and public schools were staying closed, and was able to just advocate for things like education reform as parents had a front row seat into their child's education through those really haphazard remote Zoom sessions that were continuing in public education that fall. Parents started to have what we call the Great Parent Awakening. They saw these ideologies they did not want their children to be instructed with during the school day. They also saw the low quality academic content and so much time just simply being wasted. And so that was the catalyst, that Great Parent Awakening for education freedom. It's what I've done the last 5 years. I'll stop there, but later I would love to just kind of walk you through what's happened in our nation those past 5 years.
Yeah, definitely. The first thought I had about this, both of us are in software engineering, so we are constantly making improvements to our development process. So, for example, we'll have things like automated tests that run all the time and immediately detect a problem if a code change has gone in, or different performance metrics or monitoring services. So for us, it becomes easier to get higher quality results if we keep up with the industry and innovate. And I just look at education and I don't see sometimes, the same level of openness to that, or maybe it's just because I'm not involved in that. But hopefully you're going to talk about some of these ideas that are kind of similar to the things that we're used to in our industry.
Well, absolutely. I mean, whenever you have a monopoly in an industry, it is going to be resistant to innovation, to advancing. There's not the incentive for those things to happen. It's also going to be very expensive. And so moving K 12 education into the free market is essential. It's essential because moms and dads need to be the decision maker in how and where their child is educated. They are the primary educator and they need that opportunity to select the learning environment as well as an education that's going to align with their values.
Hmm.
But it's also that free market. It's going to do what free markets do so well. It's going to increase quality, drive down costs, and spur innovation. And those are all desperately needed in K 12 education. So happy to touch on later
Yeah.
the specifics of innovation. But the first step truly is breaking up the public school monopoly, that stranglehold that they have on people having to send their child to their district public school, just that default. And so getting those incentives right, that is going to be the first step. And that is absolutely foundational in changing education in our country.
Everything you said makes sense. It would be really hard for us to develop software or get good outcomes in education if we only had one vendor and all of these kinds of policies that make them unresponsive to the customer. So we do spend a lot of taxpayer money on education. What is the status quo right now in terms of performance? Are we getting a good return on investment for all of this taxpayer money? And maybe just explain what kind of performance metrics parents would care about.
Yes, in January, the latest NAEP scores came out. That's known as the nation's report card. NAEP stands for the National Assessment of Education Progress Exam.
Mhm.
And those results were horrifying. They showed that students in public schools in our country, on average, were reading only 3 out of 10 students, so 30% of students. That means 70% of students in public schools in our country are not reading on grade level. Math was no different. Those are the subjects that were tested. And so we have a national crisis with education in our country. And we've got to do something different. And what has happened over the past 4 years to start doing something different has been historic. It's been so encouraging, exciting. And let me just walk you through that. So in 2022, Arizona governor at the time, Governor Doug Ducey, had worked hard to advance school choice even farther in Arizona. They were one of the leaders already with Florida. But he thought this should be universal. We've got to allow access for all families and break up that monopoly. And so his last year in office on July 7, 2022, Governor Ducey signed universal school choice into law. And that was a game changer for Arizona families, making all students eligible for an education savings account. But even more so, it was a catalyst for what we've seen over the last 4 years, where we've gone from less than 1% of kids in our country having access to school choice unless their parents have thousands of dollars a year for tuition money or the feasibility to homeschool, to over 50% of kids in our country. So we've gone from fewer than 500,000 to over 27 million in just 4 years. And today there's 17 states that have universal school choice. So super exciting, but we're not stopping there. The work that I get to do at Discovery Institute is to continue to advance this and advocate for this across our country. And so come January with the next legislative session, we are going to be working to get state 18 and 19 and just continue this until education freedom is available for all students in our country.
So, Keri, you mentioned the educational savings accounts. I think that's the right term, right? Education savings accounts. Can you explain how those work and how parents can utilize those in the states that offer them?
Yes, an education savings account is a school choice program that gives parents a portion of their child's state funding that would go to the public school. It's not the full amount typically, and it doesn't include the local or the federal funding. So it's dramatically reduced from what public schools spend, but it's a game changer for families. It's also an enormous savings for the states. And so it's a financially responsible thing to do, as well as ethical, that parents should not be forced to send their child to a school where their taxpayer money is going to the return rate of only 3 out of 10 children learning on grade level. And so parents receive those funds in an account. That's why it's called an education savings account. And they can allocate those towards a lot of services, whether it's services for students with special needs, tutoring, curriculum. Those funds can also be used for private school tuition. And that private school might be a micro school, a small school, whether than, or a traditional full, brick and mortar private school. And so in many states, they can also use those for homeschooling and for those expenses there. But there's high accountability for how those funds are spent. And, what the opposition always says is, we can't trust parents with money. Really? Because they're getting a lot less and they're having to have receipts and document, and it's all audited.
It's absolutely backwards.
That does not happen in the public school. That accountability is actually lacking there.
Right, exactly.
So that's what the education savings account is.
Okay. Yeah, it's crazy to me as a parent that people would even say that kind of a thing, because like you just said, the results are just abhorrent for what we're spending. And there's no other industry where that would ever be tolerated, but we do it with schools. And when we think about, I pay taxes because I own a home and whatnot, and just what you're getting from that, and especially as a Christian, the idea of being a steward in our community, we want to steward our resources well for our kids. And just to think that we're putting all this money in and we're getting subpar results, it's just crazy. So, but anyway, that was great. And I had one other question about the education savings accounts. Are you able to use those funds for vocational types of things too? Because like now it seems like there's a shift happening with the path that children might go on away from college to a more vocational path. So could you use that for, like, let's say equipment or something, if you were a homeschooler, even if you were going to go to a trade school, or could that be used in that way?
Every state is different in whether they have an education savings account, a private school scholarship, a tax credit, but even within those programs, so just say within the education savings account program in a given state, that's going to be all written out in the bill, what's allowed, what's not allowed, and they vary. And part of the reason they vary is reform-minded legislators are going to try to advocate for as much as they can and still get it passed. And oftentimes there's negotiation that happens there. And so it's not always as robust as they would like. But I do know in Arizona is one example. I have a dear friend there, Jenny Clark, who runs Love Your School, who's been a leading school choice advocate there. She was the right-hand person for Governor Odysee to implement this. Jenny is a mom of 5 kids, and they use education savings accounts. And she was sharing with me just last week that a couple of her kids take woodworking classes. And so in addition to their academics, they're getting that vocational training, the hands-on. And in Arizona, they're able to use that education savings accounts to cover those educational costs related to career technical.
Well, that's great.
So I think Bonnie and I are both fans of Thomas Sowell. We both like to read economics. So we understand the benefits of having a variety of vendors in a free market so that consumers have a choice of who is going to sell them products and services. So it's kind of hard to get that same result in the education system, especially with public education getting taxpayer money kind of automatically, and then parents kind of scrambling afterwards to try to get better options with the money they have left over. You mentioned the poor performance before. Do you think that the monopoly that public education has and the way that their teachers tend to be unionized, does that contribute to the poor performance?
In public education, we have the incentives all wrong. And so there's a stranglehold first on the pipeline of who can become a teacher, this teacher certification. And it's keeping out subject matter experts. It's keeping out people with actual industry experience, knowledge, expertise. So a very successful business person can't come back and teach a business class in a high school unless they go back to a school of education, pay tuition money, take time, get a teaching certificate, although they are far superior qualified than somebody who's gone through a general education requirements and then through a school of education. So that subject matter expertise is being kept out by this teacher certification. Also, it's very problematic, the worldview that are coming out of schools of education. And the priority is not necessarily just equipping in things like the science of reading and how to teach math well. So much of that curriculum, as you can audit what these courses require for those programs, has things to do with radical ideologies. And so teachers in the schools of ed are already being conditioned to prioritize less on academic preparation for themselves as the educator and more on these ideologies that moms and dads do not want taught during the school day, that do not align with family values. And then when they get in the system, it's this teacher union controlled salary step schedule. And so it incentivizes mere time in the system to get a raise, regardless of performance. And so unless somebody is highly motivated, they're just going to human nature, do what it takes to get by because I know the longer I stay in the system, the more money I get. Well, that does not go well as we're trying to improve performance of our students. We know from research that the teacher is the number one factor during the school day of student learning. But then you've got high achieving teachers that come in and their quality performance is completely ignored. They're not rewarded for it. And oftentimes you've got the best, most successful teachers who exit the system because they're motivated and they see, I can do something else and be in charge of my future career and be rewarded for my good work. And so sometimes they go into tutoring. Other times they might completely leave the profession altogether. And so we've got to change all those incentives. But the teacher unions have this stranglehold on that salary schedule as well as on the certification. And so those barriers to improving our system have to be broken down. And the very best way to break it down is to allow families to exit the system, because when families leave, that's fewer students, which takes fewer teachers, which is fewer union paying members, which is less money for those teacher unions. And ultimately, when they have less money, they have less political control. And so we're not going to be able to reason with these teacher unions. They've made it so clear that their priority has nothing to do with the academic learning of children. We saw this during COVID. Los Angeles Unified School District is just one example. They refused to reopen schools until radical demands were met that had nothing to do with the education of the children. For example, they demanded before they would reopen schools, this was in the name of safety and COVID, they demanded a moratorium on charter schools. They didn't want any competition, although charter schools are other public schools. Defunding the police and Medicare for all. So children were held hostage outside of their school that taxpayers were continuing to pay for in order to get those political demands met. And so the teacher unions, again, their focus is on these radical agendas, money, power, and control. We've got to take away their power by giving families an escape, an exit for their child, but as well to break down the system. And that's why I'm so passionate about education freedom. It's working in the states that have this passed. Demand is growing. People are moving to pro-freedom states to take advantage of this. And it's changing the lives of individual students, as well as it's going to have workforce, societal, as well as economic benefits for those communities, for those states.
Yeah. So it really does feel like, as a parent, it feels like teachers, or maybe not teachers, but maybe just the system in general. And I'm not a professional. I'm just a parent. But it does seem like, from my perspective, that parents are kind of the obstacles. What I've personally experienced, like, we are treated as more of the obstacles. Like, we don't really know what's best, or almost like we're bumpkins, like country bumpkins with pitchforks, because we didn't get an education degree or something like that. And they have to kind of save our kids from us. And it does feel like that. It's like Thomas Sowell called this the anointed, the vision of the anointed. It feels like that's this class of people that is sort of superior to us lower life forms, the ones that don't agree with them. That's what I see.
Bonnie, you're exactly right. And we see this in education, where parents are told that those teachers are the expert of their child's learning, and nothing could be farther from the truth. Yes, they may be professional educators, but the expert of each individual child is their parent, is mom and dad. They've been with their child since birth. They know and love them best, and they're going to be there far past a school day. And this concept that teachers know what's best and that they can work in secret from parents, the horrific things that are happening to drive a wedge between the parent and the child relationship in the name of some radical teacher who thinks, they know best. That teacher is only with that student 180 days of their entire life. And to try to break up that absolutely essential relationship and get the child to think the parent is the enemy, this is an attack on the family as much as it's an attack on the hearts and minds of that individual child, as well as this generation of children. And so that's not to say there's not wonderful, good, loving, caring teachers, but the culture within the public school is going more and more in this direction of, we know it's best. We're going to do whatever it takes to push our agenda into these impressionable minds, regardless of any type of parental involvement or support. We also see, parents are getting attacked by the medical profession as well. They're told again, this hands-off idea, I believe it's like at age 12 or 13, the child has to give consent to the parent to have medical records. I guarantee those children don't even know the address, the phone number, maybe not even the full name of their physician. And this concept, the parent who drove them there, the parent who made their breakfast, who got their clothes washed, can't know the most important things about their child is absolutely wrong. So we've got to push back as leaders with policy to say, no, it's essential for America that parents maintain their rights, that those are protected, but we also prioritize the family, and the fundamental responsibility has to be with moms and dads.
Keri, you were talking earlier about the different forms of education now, different kinds of schooling. It seems like for a long time, we've really had a very one-fits-all kind of education. And I don't know the full history of how that came about, but after the events of the last few years, we had virtual education, and now we're starting, it seems like, to move into thinking about a lot of different kinds of education. So can you talk a little bit about virtual education and the effects of what came out of COVID? Do you think virtual education is a good idea, a bad idea? Is there a hybrid? Can you just kind of talk a little bit about those kinds of ideas for us?
It's really important to look at virtual education and those haphazard remote Zoom sessions that were forced upon parents overnight. Teachers weren't trained for it. Kids weren't intentionally selected for that type of learning. We have to look at that very different than virtual education, where education is thoughtfully, intentionally delivered in the virtual setting. I was at a virtual academy pre-COVID. I led that school for 4 years. And when I came in, the school had already been around for 7 years. So it was very cutting edge at the time. But the curriculum was intentionally designed to be delivered that way. There was a process through application to have the conversation with each family of, why are you selecting this? What are your students' strengths, weaknesses? What type of learner are they? Because we wanted to make sure it was going to be a good fit. In person is not the best fit for every unique child, neither is virtual. And it was also important that moms and dads were involved instead of, just the child being unsupervised and expected to do their work on their own. We needed to make sure there was support. So virtual education, I'm a huge fan of that for the learners, that's going to best suit, and when families intentionally choose that. But what we saw in these remote Zoom sessions overnight was they tried to take the face-to-face experience and, just have kids sit at home, be quiet, listen as a teacher talked. Well, can you imagine asking a child to sit in front of a screen all day long and hold still? Think about like 5, 6, 7-year-olds. And then on the flip side, teenagers, come have somebody talk to you, on a screen and just sit wherever you are. Well, not everybody's home life was conducive to that. Not all children have their own bedroom or their own device or a quiet place or a controlled setting, internet connectivity. Like, it was an absolute disaster. And private schools proved in the fall of 2020 that they could operate fully in person safely. But again, as we talked about earlier, it was the teacher unions who drove to keep schools closed. They literally held children hostage so they could get these political demands met. They saw this as incredible leverage, and the destruction that it did to our country as a whole, as well as these children one by one on their learning loss. We are going to look back in history and say it was one of the most detrimental decisions for this generation. Now, kids are resilient, and there's a lot of hope for this generation to overcome those challenges. But the learning loss that has been incurred is going to be a lifelong challenge for these students.
Definitely. I was going to say one quick thing about the choice thing, just so people get really a good understanding. Like, imagine you had to build a house and you were only allowed one vendor. So, it would be almost impossible for you to find all the different kinds of things that you need to put together in order for your house to do everything it needs to do, because the best vendors would be specialized in things like pipes and maybe windows and maybe siding, roof shingles and things like that. So anytime that you hand the person who has to live in the house the tools to evaluate, shop around, they almost always do better. And so we should kind of be skeptical about being locked into a single vendor. It's certainly the case, in IT, where we both are, that, we switch databases once in a while when we're not happy with one and we want to switch to another, or we switch, to a different vendor for something else. It just seems to make sense that handing parents these tools would lead to a better outcome, and that because it's their child, they have the most incentive. After all, the public school teachers, if they're paid by tenure, it doesn't seem like they have some kind of incentive based on whether the child does well. It's not like they get a bonus based on whether the child goes on to start a startup company and, just make some great discovery. They don't get a bonus from that. So they're just not as interested as the parents are in what the child eventually achieves. Tell us about the radical ideologies that are being pushed in the schools. Why don't school leaders care about the values of parents and communities?
It's this idea that educators have, unfortunately, that they know best, they know better than moms and dads. And it starts again in the schools of education, where they're gradually taught these radical, far left progressive ideologies. And they are taught that it is their job to teach these to kids, even in secret from parents, knowing without doubt that it's not what moms and dads want. And so some specific ideologies, I think your listeners know, but it's that DEI, the critical race theory, the anti-American worldview, the rewriting of history, radical gender ideology, the hypersexualization of content during the school day that is not age appropriate. And just this notion that America is a systemically racist country and that our institutions are all systemically racist. It's just this horrible worldview for an impressionable young child, as well as looking at things like capitalism literally being abhorred, and things like socialism, communism, Marxism are taught, they're celebrated, and these students then exit their 13 years of K-12 education seat time around age 18, at which point they're eligible to vote. What are they going to vote for? They're going to vote for nothing other than these ideologies that they've been taught as truth. There hasn't been any critical thinking or presentation of competing ideas to help a student to think through those. Instead, this is taught as truth. And then when they're 18 and they're eligible to vote, they vote for those things that they've been told. And we see what's happened in our country as a result of those ideologies. And when public education has a monopoly, it's far more than just on K-12 education. It's truly a monopoly of the American mind, and it's impacting those students far past age 13. George Barna's research shows that an individual's worldview is largely shaped by age 12. So you've got sixth grade. So a lot of parents will say, oh, we'll do public school, or, it's not as important what my child's hearing when they're younger. It's more those upper grades. Well, thinking about that research, it matters from day one what your child is hearing. And you don't want to put your child in conflict of what you're trying to do at home being undone during the school day by somebody that you're telling them to listen and obey to. That's what parents do when you drop your child off. Have a good day, listen and obey your teacher.
Mm-hmm.
But then they're having to explain, well, listen when it's time to line up for lunch. But when they're telling you, about gender ideology, well, that's wrong. Don't listen to that. It's a really difficult place for a child. So again, it comes back to this idea of empowering parents with education freedom. That's why we're working so hard at Discovery Institute to make sure that more and more families have the ability, when public education is not aligned with what they want for their child, that they can exit that system and have a portion of their taxpayer money to enter an alternative.
That was very well said. It feels like there's a sort of groupthink that is constantly being engendered. And, kids are very susceptible to peer pressure. And I think everybody, you might mention like your opinion on abortion or something like that. And kids are going to be, let's say, loath to disagree about anything that might make them be ostracized or something like that. And these leftist agendas are all pushed, and they all kind of, I think, whether the kids agree or not, they feel like they kind of have to agree. And then I think it happens on the parent level too. And I was going to ask this too, Keri, how do you think, you're working at the policy level, but like I'm just a parent of kids. So how do I push back on things that I might see just at my level as a parent without succumbing to that kind of groupthink at the parent level too, where it's the schools and they care about our kids and they're doing a great job. And how do you just sort of work on that?
First, I would say policy is very important, but nothing is more important than moms and dads. So you play the most essential role in this. And reminding parents of that, because they're constantly told that they don't know, that somebody else knows better, and that they shouldn't question. So the best thing that parents can do is continue to have dialogue with their student. And I say student because when the student, isn't necessarily still a child, as they move through adolescence, they may tell you, no, I don't want to talk, or, everything's fine. Well, keep leaning in. That's the best thing you can do as a parent, because a lot of times they might just say that, but they are willing to talk, or maybe deep down they really want to tell you what's going on, but they might be uncomfortable because the content was so sexual that they were taught during the school day. It might take them a while to get the courage to say those horrific words and these concepts to a parent. That's very uncomfortable for a child, not only to be too exposed to it, but then have to verbalize it. And that's across, topics. That's just one example. So continue to lean in, continue to have that strong, close relationship with your child, even when it may seem that they don't want it. They really do. And then I would say, talk to other parents, share what you know, share what you see, talk about it, try to get information, what is their child saying? What are they hearing? Because you are not alone. And the schools, unfortunately, we saw this during COVID, and it's are continuing to keep parents out and to say, we know best, nothing to see here. Some schools in some states have gone as far as to no longer let parents pass the school office. And this is the name of safety with health as well as security. That is completely wrong. Moms and dads should absolutely be welcomed into the classroom. We know from research, when parents are involved, that is going to absolutely benefit their child as well as other students in the classroom. And so parents should speak up. They should band together, but just know that you are not alone. And when you have questions, concerns, raise those. When you're ignored, talk to others, keep raising them. Do not let up, because it is your child at stake. And hats off to those parents who have done that, who do that every day. Nobody looks, it's not glamorous. What you get back is not always nice. But in due time, you will be so thankful that you continue to advocate for your child And then I would also say research options, see what other alternative education options you can make. There's a lot of low cost, high quality education options that are coming on the scene, whether it's hybrid, virtual, micro school, classical education, some great charter school options that are values aligned. You've got to, vet every education option. But there's ways to get creative, to band together with other families to figure out a solution. But then also just know what's happening in your state. These school choice programs are coming up so fast. A lot of times there's early adopters who maybe have been following the policy or they're watching the news, so they know that it's happening. But the vast majority still don't know in the states if it just got passed this year or last year. And so share what you know, talk to other parents, and then constantly be looking online, does my state have a school choice program? What is that? Do I qualify? And try to find an alternative where your values are aligned and you know that your child is going to get a great education to prepare them for life academically, but as well as their heart and mind.
That's very good advice. You're opening my mind to the different options, because in my mind, there's basically kind of like three options. There's public school, there's private school, and then there's homeschool. There's not really in between things. So kind of what you're leading into is that there's a lot of variety. So that's good. That's good to know. So many parents are trying homeschooling to get control over what their kids are learning. Can you talk about the pathway from homeschooling to college or to a high-paying trade, and what policies are you working on or others are working on that can make this work better?
Yes. So homeschooling as well as private school before COVID, we saw that the cost was less. So nationally, private schools on average spend $4,000 per less to educate a child. When I say spend, that's, what they're charging for tuition versus on average what a public school spends, $4,000 less. And historically, there's a consistent difference in quality of academics, how students do in those private schools. Homeschool is the same. Parents are not spending what their neighborhood district school is spending to educate their child, but the results are higher. And so we saw that pre-COVID. We're continuing to see that. So it's these alternative options, but there's more and more micro schools, and that's a great avenue for families to be in a smaller environment. And those tuition price points are typically much, much lower than that full brick and mortar campus school. And so that's something, again, just to research and find those options. But talking about educating students for the future, for high demand, high growth career fields, there's more and more industries that are not requiring a college degree. There was a report in the Wall Street Journal last year that showed nearly 50% of parents would prefer not to send their child to a 4-year university after high school, regardless of any obstacles, including finances. So that is mind-blowing.
Yeah.
Going on to the 4-year college is no longer a part of the American dream for half of parents in our country because they've seen what's happening on these college campuses and they don't want that for their child. Also, employers have seen the lack of quality critical thinking, skills that these kids come out of. They might have that degree, but they don't have the hands-on skills that their industry needs. And so while that's happening on the parent side, the employer side, that same report last year showed that 2/3 of high school students believe they'll be just fine without college. So again, there's not as much interest to go to college. Higher ed enrollment has dropped by 3 million students since 2011. But yet, research shows that 1/4 of high school students can't name even one career that interests them. So fewer kids are going on, but they don't have a game plan. And that is really detrimental to society, to communities, as well as to the individual when they're not finding purpose and meaning in their life. And then they're just going to be dependent upon government to take care of them. And so we want to expose kids to things. These industry-specific high schools that I advocate for have high academics, but they also give kids top character formation, training, as well as industry-specific hands-on. It's a great way to combat the chronic absenteeism that we see in our country where kids don't want to go to school. But when they know, I'm not just going to sit in a row and have a teacher lecture me about, some topic that they don't think is relevant to their life. They know if I go to school today, whether it's an aviation academy or something, today I'm going to work on building a plane, or today I'm going to be on the flight simulator. That is transformational and getting the kid engaged, getting them motivated. And we know from research, when students are engaged and motivated, academic performance goes up dramatically. And so it's a great way to prepare the future workforce of America while we're also changing the trajectory of these kids' lives simply by exposing them to high demand, high growth career fields.
Yeah, that's a great answer.
So, Keri, you've talked about school choice and ESAs and things like that, and Arizona and Florida. So tell us a little bit more about which states and localities are doing a pretty good job of innovating to provide students with a better education.
Well, let me give your listeners the list of those states that have passed the universal school choice. And so once they've passed that, then we see a lot of education entrepreneurs come on the scene to grow the supply. And that's where the innovation is happening to meet the parental demand of families that can exit. So those states that have the universal school choice now are Arizona, West Virginia, Iowa, Utah, Arkansas, Florida, Oklahoma, Ohio, North Carolina, Alabama, Louisiana, Tennessee, Idaho, Wyoming, Texas, Indiana, and New Hampshire. And I will say 6 of those states were just this year in 2025. One of the states was at 97% as of a couple of years ago. They went 100 this year, but 5 new states just this year. So we are not losing the momentum of parents wanting options, and more states and political leaders are seeing this is a winning issue, all the way from coming from the White House down to the local level. Empowering parents is the way to go. So really excited about all of that that's happening. But once you get the universal school choice, you get these new education options. It's driving down the cost because of the competition, consumer choice. It's bringing up the quality. It's spurring innovation. Indiana is a great example with Governor Mike Braun. I was able to visit with him in his office in July of this year. We talked all about innovation. Indiana is truly leading the country in K-12 education innovation. They've got, if not the top, one of the top states for the number of micro schools, which are just these small learning environments for students. But they typically also have themes to them, like it might be a farm or a STEM school, this hands-on learning and something that gets kids so excited. And when they're curious and they're excited, again, their motivation goes up. But it just helps them unlock their passions, their creativity, the way God's wired them. Instead of this factory model, one-size-fits-all system that is truly crushing who they are, and it's hindering their ability to be creative and to learn and to be curious because they're told, sit, don't move, don't talk, do this worksheet, instead of exploring and learning in a way that the small micro school settings can do. So Indiana's doing that. They're doing so many other great, exciting things. I would just point your listeners to an article I wrote recently for the Epoch Times that's titled, Indiana is Innovating More Than Any Other State, Their Education. And they can read, it's a long article because there's so many things they're doing, but it starts in young grades with lots of early literacy. And they're breaking the horrible trend in our country of kids not learning to read well. And they're just moving it all the way up. Mississippi's a great example of what they've done. And it's not rocket science, but it's just getting back to phonics-based instruction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just thinking about, we already let parents choose the extracurricular activities like sports and music and all these other things. And if you had your child and the child was already interested in fixing electronics things and writing code or working with wood, like you say, it does seem reasonable for the parent to say, hey, let me see how far this kid can go in this particular field. I'll just move them into a school where they would get advanced training for that at an earlier age. Seems like it would work really well.
Well, we've covered a lot, Keri. Do you have any final thoughts for the listeners? Anything you want people to know?
I would just say, moms and dads, remember that you're the primary educator of your child, and God has entrusted you with that responsibility. So as much as the public education system or others would tell you that you do not know what's best, or that a hands-off approach is better, I would say do not listen to that. Engage, know what's happening. When you can, speak up. And if you need to make a change, do whatever you can. The sacrifice will be worth it. And get creative. Figure out, maybe there's different people in the community that can share who's going to teach what days. But there's ways to do this low cost and creative. And don't worry if you're not an educator or subject matter expertise. You have what it takes to be the primary educator of your child. And that time that you're going to invest truly will be the greatest gift that you can give your child.
All right. I think that's a great place for us to stop for today. So thank you so much for coming on the show, Keri.
My pleasure.
And thank you also to Bonnie for agreeing to fill in for Rose today.
Also my pleasure.
I hope you had fun. Listeners, if you enjoyed the episode, please consider helping us out by sharing this podcast with your friends, writing us a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify, subscribing and commenting on YouTube, and hitting the like button wherever you listen to this podcast. We appreciate you taking the time to listen, and we'll see you again in the next one.